welcome to episode 33 of Schick Picks Six. As always, I'm Melanie Schickler, and with me today is ESPN SportsCenter anchor Michael Eaves. Michael, thanks for taking the time to be here today.
Glad I can do it. How you doing?
Good. How are you? I like the trophies in the background.
Yeah, someone the other day said it was a subtle flex, but honestly, it's the only place in my house that sort of serves as a decent background for these digital shows and IG Lives and stuff, and that just happens to be where my wife put some of my trophies, so that's all I got.
All right, well, let's not waste any time. Let's jump into some of the news. Let's start with the news coming out of Miami on Monday. Tua Tagovailoa signed a 4-year, $30 million contract, and a lot of people are wondering who's going to be the starting quarterback, him or Ryan Fitzpatrick. And Tua's coming off a bad season-ending injury, but the fact that he signed this contract, what kind of message does that send to Fitzpatrick for his future?
Well, I think even before the contract, Ryan Fitzpatrick knew that Tua was going to be the quarterback of the future in Miami. The only question is, when does that future actually begin? Now, let's say for sake of this conversation that the season starts on time, I would assume that Ryan Fitzpatrick would be your opening week starter because of experience and things of that nature. But I would also be stunned if Tua is not the starter by some point in the season. Let's say it's week 8, week 9, somewhere in the halfway point that he's not the starter, unless maybe Ryan Fitzpatrick has the Dolphins. Let's say they're 6-2 and they're leading the AFC East, then maybe you don't put Tua out there to be the starter because you're winning. But he's the quarterback of the future in South Florida. There's no question about that. And I think if you're Brian Flores in that organization, you want him to get into that starting role as soon as possible once he has a little bit of seasoning, and maybe 7-8 weeks into the season would be enough for them to put him in that position.
Right, and I think, like you said, if the season does start in September, it could be Fitzpatrick, most likely will be. But if it doesn't, that could also be beneficial for Tua because he has extra time to recover and make sure he's actually 100%, and that could give him a better chance to actually start week 1.
Yeah, the real key for him, though, is getting into that quarterback room with the coaches so they can find out how quickly he absorbs information, takes it to the practice field, and then executes it. That's going to tell you if he's ready to play or not. I think physically they feel pretty good about it based on where they drafted him and what they saw from the video and things of that nature. But, yeah, more time for your body is always better than less time. But for him, it's really going to be about absorbing that system and being able to execute it on the field.
Right. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. You spoke with MMA journalist Ariel Helwani yesterday on Instagram Live, and there was a lot of Twitter back and forth between Conor McGregor and Justin Gaethje. What did he have to say about a potential matchup?
Well, it's all about Conor trying to maneuver himself into a position where he could get Gaethje and be that next big fight at 155 pounds, as opposed to Gaethje trying to go after Khabib and getting the unified lightweight belt in the UFC. So it looks as though Gaethje and Khabib will be the fight. Also, they're managed by the same people, so it's a little easier to get those two people aligned than trying to get Conor involved in some kind of three-way capacity. But as far as Dana White is concerned, he's about the biggest fight, making the biggest money and the biggest splash. But if the other two fighters involved, which are Gaethje and Khabib, want to fight each other more than they want to fight Conor, then you're going to have to acquiesce to the champion, the two champions you have, the unified champion, also the interim champion. So I see it coming with Gaethje and Khabib. And Ariel feels that way also, but that's just Conor being Conor and trying to put himself into the conversation to bring all the attention to him, but also try to get himself paid.
Right, of course. I mean, whatever happens, people will be watching that because that's one of the only sports going on right now.
Yeah.
I mean, we obviously wish it was more, but the UFC is going. We have the fight night tonight. So they're off and running, but let's talk about some sports that are trying to get back into the mix. MLB, NBA, and the English Premier League. Let's start with soccer a little bit. So they want to start back up again June 1st. Preliminary plans, government officials approved it. Do you think it's a little bit easier for them since the risk of contracting the virus overseas isn't as great as it is over here?
Well, they've been dealing with it longer on that level than the U.S. has. That's number one. So they've had more time to track the data, to have an idea of how the virus is spreading compared to what we did here in the United States. So they are ahead of the curve in that regard. Also, there's less people. When you talk about population, in terms of who's going to be around these players as they are playing and how easy it's to isolate them compared to larger places, they have that advantage as well. So, yeah, I could see something happening in England way faster than it can happen here in the United States because of all those factors that we just mentioned. So I'm not surprised that they're going to try to move forward with that date, and also what happened in Germany with Bundesliga and having that model in terms of a way to put this thing back together. That doesn't surprise me at all. The only question will be, what will that league do if a player or coach or someone relative to those particular teams contracts COVID-19? How will you respond then? What's going to be the protocol there? Because we saw in UFCs, we just mentioned, they isolated a fighter and two of his cornermen, and they had no other contact with anyone else involved in the card, and they went on as scheduled. How will the Premier League deal with something similar?
Right. I think it's entirely different, especially because you have so many people on the field at once, whereas UFC is obviously two people in the ring. But I think
I'm sorry, it takes way more people to put on a Premier League soccer match than it does a UFC fight card, too.
Right. So it could pose as much more difficult for them.
Absolutely. That's the thing. Like, the more numbers you have involved, the more difficulties and more scenarios that you're going to face. It's just a matter of how do you mitigate the risk as much as possible, and then do you have the right protocols involved if something happens down the road? And quite honestly, you won't really know that until it happens.
Right. All right, let's move on to the NBA. They sent out a players' poll yesterday to see if members want to continue the season. And Adam Silver said, look, the decision doesn't have to be made this month, but if games are canceled, the union and the NBA have agreed to withhold 25% of player contracts. Do you think that this is something that all leagues should try to mirror because it's eliminating some of the financial problems when they're trying to return?
Well, I think even, let's take the baseball players union for an example. That union has been the strongest union of any professional sports players union in history, right? And those dudes always fight for every cent they can get from the owners. But even they would realize, and I know the NBA players feel the same way, that with less games, you have less revenue. You have less from the TV contract. You have less from the gates, especially with no fans coming there. So there's just not the same amount of money to be made if you play the remainder of the season under different circumstances compared to how you normally play them. So, yes, you do have to take into consideration that the revenue's not there, so the salaries can't be there also. If your priority is getting the season finished, if the NBA, to crown a 2020 champion before you start the next season, then that's something you absolutely have to do for a myriad of reasons, because other people have to be paid as well that aren't the players and necessarily the owners. So I do think that makes a lot of sense. I just don't know if they're going to be able to play the end of this season to crown a champion and then have that other season start, around Christmas or even after the first of the year. I just think so much has to go involved in that, and I'd be a little stunned if it actually happened.
Right, and you mentioned the MLB, so I wanted to touch on that too. They seem like they're on the brink of finalizing a plan to maybe start training in June and opening day early July. But the biggest problem seems to be the 50-50 revenue split, and they're the only league without a salary cap. Do you think it's kind of inevitable that they're having financial problems?
Well, let me say this. They're not having financial problems. They're having financial disputes, right? So that goes back to, what I was saying about the players always trying to get every single dollar from the owners. And granted, there's a history involved there that goes back to collusion and things of that nature, where the players always thought they were getting cheated by the owners. So that always is an impact on how they approach each and every negotiation with the owners going forward. And they do want their full prorated salaries, even if they don't have fans, because they're banking their money on the television revenue. Now, again, for me personally, that television revenue will not be the same because you don't have the same number of games. So they want to take the same cut of the games remaining, not the full contract, obviously. And then they're not really worried about the concessions and the gate ticket sales that the owners are always concerned about. So the players want their full money, and then with the owners that take a little bit of a cut because they don't get the fans in the stands that they normally do. I don't know how that's going to play out, quite honestly, because the players union, they've shown in the past that they're willing to do whatever it takes to get as much money as they want. And the question becomes, if you're an owner, you're not making money, you need those guys back on the field to make any money whatsoever. How much are you willing to give up to make that happen?
Right. And if the owners want to make any money, they have to use their players to actually play games and generate some sort of revenue. So
Correct.
like you said, I think it'll be them in the end that end up taking some sort of a pay cut to make things happen.
Yeah, but remember this. The owners have always believed that they have more money and fewer people, that they can put leverage on the players, that they can sit out longer, if you will, in terms of not making money and not having games. This situation is different, though, because it's not a straight contract negotiation, labor situation. This is a pandemic to cancel a bunch of games. So maybe that thinking by the owners will change because, as you said, they want to make money as well.
Yeah, all right, let's end on a lighter note here. I want to hear whether you were working a game or whether you were watching as a fan. What's your favorite sports memory?
Wow. That's a tough one. Favorite sports memory is either working the event or just watching as a fan. Wow.
You could do one of each.
And here's the deal. I've been asked this question before in terms of what's the coolest event that I've covered or things of that nature. And I've been very fortunate to cover some cool stuff. I mean, I was there for Kobe's 81-point game. I was there for the Kick Six game between Auburn and Alabama. I was there for the Bush Push game between USC and Notre Dame, the Lennox Lewis-Mike Tyson fight. Like, I've been very fortunate in my career to see some cool stuff. Game 7 between the Celtics and the Lakers, I was there for that. I think the most incredible thing I saw in person was definitely the Kick Six game between Auburn and Alabama. And I was standing on the field at the end of that game, and the last 2 touchdowns that Auburn scored were in the same end zone. I was literally standing at that left pylon where both of those touchdowns were scored. So the dude crossed in front of me both times. And just to see the reaction from the people, like, they stormed the field. And I've been in that situation several times, but there were so many older people on the field. Usually that's a student thing, right, at a college venue. But there were people I saw on that field in their 60s and 70s, just stunned and excited of what had happened there at Jordan-Hare. And for me, that's pretty high up there because I didn't have a rooting interest, obviously. I'm from Kentucky, but I do love SEC football. But I didn't really care who won between Auburn and Alabama. But to be there for that moment and that environment, yeah, that's probably my favorite.
And those are 2 of the biggest fans in the country. When you think of Auburn and Alabama, like, what kind of fan base is out there besides those 2? Like, that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Michigan, Ohio State, it's Red Sox, Yankees, like it's USC, UCLA, it's Kentucky, Louisville, but the hatred, I mean, I'm going to use the word hatred. I usually don't use that word when it comes to sports rivalries, but with Auburn, Alabama, it's straight hate between a lot of those people and those respective fan bases and the players going back and forth. Like, that is real, and for that moment to happen between those 2 teams, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. That's
awesome. Well, I want to thank you again for being here. And to all of you at home, stay tuned for episode 34 of Schick Picks Six coming up next week.